I hate spear memes. Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. There are memes everywhere about the fact that the spear is better than the sword, that the spear is a simple pointy stick and still it is better because of reach or whatever. It is simple to make compared to a sword, blah blah blah. So there are a variety of reasons why the spear is considered a better weapon than the sword. But today I'm here to tell you that actually it is the opposite. Now, if we put two fencers of equal skill, one in front of each other, let's say two me, one is holding a spear, the other one is holding a long sword or a one-handed sword or whatever kind of sword. They are facing each other in a plain ground. There is nothing around, no stones, no trees, no houses, nothing. And they are going to fight each other. For sure, the spear will win, 100%. Like, not 100%, but the greatest majorities of the times, the spear will win, because it has more reach. That's it. That's the only pros that this kind of pointy stick has compared to the longsword. But this is not real life. This is not like fighting worked back in the days. There were a huge varieties of context in which fighting was applied. And so that's why the spear is not the best weapon around, was not the best weapon around, and that's why the sword was so prominent back in the days. And so here we are, 10 motivations why the sword was better than the spear. The first motivation is that it was possible to carry the sword around in the greatest majority of the social context, while it wasn't the case for the spear, of course. If you had a motivation to carry a spear around, if you were a guard or a soldier in a certain kind of context, you had access to a spear. Otherwise, not, of course. The sword instead was socially accepted in the greatest majority of the context. And so you had access to a sword in the greatest majority of the cases. That's the first motivation why the sword was better than a spear. Now, the second motivation is that the sword was extremely versatile. Now, with the sword you can thrust, you can cut, you can pommel strike, you can strike with the crossguard, you can use it by half swording, you can use it on the opposite way and strike like if it was a polyaxe. And that's why the sword is so versatile. So you can adapt this kind of weapon in the greatest majority of the cases you may face. And while in certain of these cases is not the best, for sure is still a viable option. That's why it was a better weapon than the spear in the greatest majority of the cases, not in every single case. And sometimes it was outmatched by the reach of the spear, as always. But in every other case, the sword was the best choice. The third motivation is that the sword is more precise than the spear. Now, this is because it is shorter on average. With the sword, it is easier to aim for certain targets and to control the weapon. This is because it is shorter, of course, so you don't have the reach again. But at the same time, it is easier to aim for certain targets. For instance, at the same skill level, it is easier to strike an arm or hand with a sword compared to a spear. Aiming for little targets is not that easy. Of course, if you master the use of this weapon, which is simpler, and that's why it is considered a better weapon by some people. If you master the use of the spear, it gets easier and easier to strike even at small targets. But still, at the same level of experience, it is easier to strike at an arm or a hand by using a sword. Also because you can reach that target in every possible direction with a sword, while instead with the spear you can just thrust at that target, which is indeed possible, but more complex. Now, the fourth motivation is that the sword is effective at any distance with ease and very fast, in a sense that you can change the distance at which you are playing very easily by using the different way in which you can strike with the sword. This is related to the fact it is versatile. But it is versatile not only because it may strike in different ways, but it is versatile also because it may strike at different distances with effectiveness. With the sword you can change the distance at which you are fencing very easily, you can change the direction in which you are fencing very easily and strike in different directions with effectiveness, with all the possible ways in which you can strike with this versatile weapon. The fifth motivation is that the sword was more important both in civilian life and in military life. Now, if you think about it, in civilian life was your main weapon of choice for a variety of motivations that we have already mentioned. And in military life was mainly a secondary weapon, which means that even if you were a knight on your horse or you were in whatever kind of social context, in whatever kind of period of history, for the greatest majority of history in which the sword existed, the sword was more important because either it was your main weapon, and in some cases it was the case both for infantry and for cavalry. But also, when this wasn't your main weapon, it was your secondary weapon. And if you were, for instance, a knight, or you were in some kind of impact heavy cavalry, let's say, and you had a spear, well, the spear was useful for the first strike, and then you had to use your backup weapon, which maybe was a hammer, who knows, or a mace, but in many cases it was a sword. And that's why the sword was so important also back in the days in both social contexts. The sixth motivation is that the sword is made entirely out of steel, while the spear it is not. Now, while breaking the shaft of a spear is not that easy, it seems that it was indeed possible to do it. Even during the most important duel that we talk about sometimes, which was the one between Galeazzo da Mantova and Boucicaut in the 14th century, at the end of the 14th century, Boucicaut ended up breaking the spear of Galeazzo da Mantova. And we are sure that this happened simply because the one which is talking about it was an Italian chronist. So he didn't have any kind of motivation to lie on the subject. And it seems that Boucicaut broke the spear of Galeazzo just by breaking it with his own armed arms, which is something impressive, but for sure tells something about the spear, what it was a spear back in the days, how it was made most probably, and if it was possible to break it or not. And indeed it was possible to do it. While a sword, for sure it was possible to break a sword, everything can be destroyed in a certain way. But breaking a sword was indeed harder than breaking the shaft of a spear, for sure, or to disferrare, as Fiore says, a spear, which means taking away the steel part from the shaft of the spear. That's why the sword was better than a spear. The seventh motivation is that parrying and deflecting the blows of any other kind of weapon or of another sword, it is easier with a sword rather than with a spear. Now, that's why, again, the sword is versatile. You can easily parry by blocking the blade of an opponent or cutting over the sword of the opponent or just deflecting it or moving away and trying to deflect it by yielding against the strength of the opponent's weapon. All these kind of motions are to an extent possible with a spear, but they are extremely harder to land with a spear. Instead, with a sword, far easier. That's why the sword is better than the spear. The eighth motivation is that the spear has a lot of reach advantage, but this is true only at certain conditions. What if you had to turn around a corner, for instance? Not that easy to do with a spear. What if there is vegetation around and you can't move your spear? The sword can fence in narrow places in the greatest majority of the cases compared to a spear, and sometimes you can even cut through if there is a lot of intention to something that is trying to stop you, like a branch, for instance. That's why the sword is better than the spear, at least that's what I say. The ninth motivation is that the spear is predictable. Now, it is easy to understand what I'm going to do. I'm most probably going to either thrust upward or thrust downward. And this is the two things that the spear do, generally speaking. You can also strike with your shaft, but it is far less dangerous than just poking the opponent with your pointed stick. Now, even if, and this is a paradox, I know, even this, if this is the motivation, why is this considered so good as a weapon? Because it is simple to master, to an extent actually. It is simple to approach actually, not to master, because mastering it is another thing. It is simple to approach. Everyone can just poke people in front of them, so with ease actually. But at the same time, this makes the spear predictable. And if the fighter which is using the spear is not experienced, you can deal with the opponent pretty easily actually. If the fighter is experienced, then that's another story. But because you can actually understand what is coming at you, well, you can at least make some plan about how to deal with this kind of attacks. Remember, I'm not saying that facing a spear with a sword in hand is easy. The first thing that I said is that on a plain ground, two fighters, two fencers of equal skill facing each other, the one which is holding the spear will most probably win in the greatest majority of the cases. But not in every single case. And it depends from the conditions. And it depends from the social context in which you are, and if you can actually carry a spear. And if you can move it around with ease, and so on, and so on, and so on. That's why the sword is better than the spear. And the 10th motivation, because the sword is better than the spear, is that the sword is cooler. It's cooler in every single sense. It is cooler to use because you can do a variety of things. It is more complex, but it is more rewarding because of the same motivation when you learn how to use it properly. It is cooler because it represents many things. It is an important symbol in human history actually. It represented the law, it represented knighthood, it represented a lot of things, and it has always been a symbol of power and virtues at the same time. That's why the sword is better than the spear. So here we are, 10 motivations why the sword is better than the spear. Actually, I love both weapons. I prefer the sword, but that's another story. But I was so pissed off by all that memes that are around that I decided to make a video on the sword. And for sure, the sword was better than the spear. Thanks for watching as always. Remember to check my Patreon link in the description if you want to support me and the channel. And as always, see you next time.